It's good to be with you again this evening. Appreciate you coming out to be a part of this final service of this week. We've enjoyed being here in your presence. We hope that you've benefited from the lessons. I'm especially thankful to have a good friend, Lemoyne Dodson, here this evening, as well as my older brother, Dick. Now, Dick, some people may tell you that your name came up earlier in the week. Just discount that. They're trying to cause trouble, okay? Don't pay attention to that. But Dick's in to visit right now. He had a funeral a couple days ago and is going home on Monday, so it gave me a rare chance to get to spend some time with him. We live a good ways apart. I live in southeastern Ohio, and he lives in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, so we don't get to see each other very much other than right around hunting season. Sometimes at deer season we're both out, so it's been good to spend some time with him. I don't know, I don't think I told you this earlier in the week, but one time I was in a meeting for the Littleton Church of Christ near 100, and a couple of men came all the way from almost in Moundsville, West Virginia, to hear Dick. They had heard that a Bartrug was having a gospel meeting at Littleton, and they thought it was Dick, and so they came to hear him, and when they saw me, one of them said, "Well, I thought Dick was holding this meeting." And I said, "No, it's the other Bartrug." And I could tell by the look on his face that he wanted to just turn around and go back home. But he was too nice to do it. So I've always appreciated him for that. Talked with Steve Stevens once, and Steve said that a lot of times people always try to get some sort of competition between him and his brother David. And people do that with Dick and I as well. And I just usually tell people, we're not in competition. We're partners, and it's just good to have him here this evening. We're closing this evening with a discussion on raising children. If I would have picked the topics, this probably wouldn't have been one of them, because you have to come across as a little bit more of an expert than I am to say all of the things that you really would want to say. But there are a lot of things I wish I had known about child raising when I was raising my children. Unfortunately, as I began to find some of those things out, my children were already out on their own. And I learned a long time ago, you can't unbreak glass. If you break glass, it's broke. You can't unbreak it. And so all you can do is just make the changes you can possibly make and have the best relationship with your children from that point on you possibly can have. And I'm thankful to God that I have the opportunity to do that. I have 3 children, Leanne, Judy, and Richard. Leanne and Richard each live with their families within about an hour of us. Judy and her husband live down near Burlington, North Carolina. And so like most families, scattered out a little bit, we don't get to see each other as often as we wish we could. But now we've got the grandchildren, and we get to spend some time with them, and it's a good time of life. But getting there isn't always a barrel of monkeys. Getting there is sometimes very difficult because there's a lot involved in parenting. There's a lot involved in raising children. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, Paul for a moment discusses family and some of the responsibilities, and he talks about the husbands and wives, and then he talks to fathers. And he says to them, don't bring your children to wrath, but raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, the word that's translated nurture there means something along the line of training. It corresponds to the word in Proverbs 22 and verse 6, where it says, train up a child in the way he should go. They're similar in their meaning. But the idea was, fathers, you've got to train or give direction to your children. But don't provoke them to wrath as you do it. Instead, realize the importance of God in their lives. Make sure that you're the best father model that you can be for your children, and try to raise them and with all of the love and the patience and the determination that God tries to raise us. We are parents, and as parents, we have responsibilities to our children. And those responsibilities involve nurturing them and admonishing them. He says, you bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. The word admonition comes from a word which more literally means guidance as to duty and responsibility. It's not just our job to make sure our children live to be 16 or 18 or 21. It's our job to provide them training and direction during that time frame, but it's also our responsibility to instill within them qualities that will help them to be good and profitable citizens and neighbors and friends and husbands and wives. Paul was giving fathers a big responsibility there. Of course, the Jewish people always did look to the patriarch, the father, as the leader. In today's society, that may not be paralleled to the way it used to be. But he's still saying to parents, you have a tremendous job ahead of you. Isn't it fun raising children? I don't know how many different ways I've heard it said. I heard a man say one time, I have 2 children, and my daughter is the most delightful, wonderful, beautiful girl to have around, and you just almost get homesick when she's gone. And I have a son, and I wouldn't take $1 million for him. But 2 or 3 times a day, I think about giving him away. You ever feel that way? Yeah, there are just some times when they get to the end of your rope. Someone else said, I have been trying to raise my children for 15 years now, and I've determined that the only thing I can think of to compare to it is nailing Jell-O to a wall. You're not going to be very successful at that. Someone else said, raising children's kind of like herding cats. Mark Twain, however, had the wisest explanation of child raising I think I ever heard. He said in his own inimitable way, when a child reaches the age of 13, you ought to put them in a barrel, seal the barrel completely except for the tap hole. And then when they reach 18, seal the tap hole. That might save a lot of problems, but the kids probably wouldn't like that very well, would they? Now, there's a mom that's laughing almost too much, her mom to be. Raising children. What a wonderful, wonderful thing. Challenging, but wonderful. A few years ago, I was in a gospel meeting up in northeastern Ohio, and I went to a breakfast. And the guest speaker that day was the owner of the Cleveland Indians baseball franchise. And of course, where I live, they live and breathe either Cincinnati Reds or Cleveland Indians. It's just the nature of where they live. When they see my WV on anything, they say, what have you got that bullseye on the back of your truck for? Anyway. But I listened to him talk about the troubles the Indians have had and some of the trades they had made, etc. And then he opened it up to questions. And one man asked him a question. He said, are you concerned about the diminishing number of African American professional baseball players? Now, I don't watch a lot of baseball, but my understanding was that there was a time frame, and maybe it's still happening, when fewer and fewer African Americans were interested enough in baseball to become good enough to play professionally. And he said, yes, I'm concerned about it. And so the follow-up question was, well, what do you think the problem is? And he answered it by quoting a member of the Negro Baseball Hall of Fame, who said, they got to have a daddy to play catch with them. They got to have a daddy to play catch with them. when the family breaks down, when parenting is not there in those vital, raising, influencing years, there's going to be a price to pay. It'll most definitely be paid by the children, to some degree by others in the family, but in a sense by society as a whole. For that reason, I want to share with you tonight 3 passages of Scripture that deal almost completely with raising children. I just want to share them with you, similar to last night, talk to you of what they say and how we might interpret that in our lives. And then I've got to pretty much leave the lesson to you. But the first of those passages is Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Now, that's a very well-known passage. It says something to the effect of, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, I need to caution you before I say anything else that Proverbs is an example of what is known as wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is not meant to teach absolute, every time it happens, truths. It's designed to teach us and familiarize us with generalizations. To give you another example from Proverbs, there's a proverb that says, a soft answer turns away wrath. You might add, well, most of the time, but it doesn't always turn away wrath. That's a generalization. That's a probability. And much the same way in this proverb. This proverb is no guarantee to us with absolute certainty that if we do everything right and cross all our T's and dot all our I's, our children will grow up to be everything they ought to be. I wish it were, but it isn't. It's just a reminder to us that they are much more likely to do what they ought to as they grow up, if we train them in the way they should go. And I don't want any of you, if you've raised children who have drifted from the Lord, to punish yourself by thinking, what didn't I do right? Remember, they have their own minds. And there comes a time when they choose whether they'll go to church, not whether you choose for them. And there comes a time when they have to determine whether they will accept or reject what you taught them. So this isn't done to make you feel bad, because I've known a lot of Christian parents who've done everything about as good as it can be done, who've lost their children to the world. And it wasn't the parents' fault. It was the child's decision. So kind of keep that in mind. But as you keep that in mind, listen to what makes it probable that your children will turn out well. He begins by saying, train up a child in the way he should go. The Hebrew word translated train there actually referred to either of 2 scenarios. One of them was to the training of a horse, and it had reference there to the putting of a bit or a rope in the horse's mouth to kind of cut its spirit back and hold it back and direct it in the direction, because you were training that horse to be rideable, to be dependable. And so you did what you had to do to get that horse to go where you wanted it to go and to stop when you wanted it to stop. The other usage of that very same word involved babies. Now, that doesn't mean you take a rope and put it in a baby's mouth. It just means that the Hebrews recognized that babies need direction too. That babies have spirits that have to come under control. That babies have behavioral patterns that have to be addressed. And that babies, and this is where it really came into play, that babies, if they're going to live and survive after birth, have to learn to nurse. It's not a natural thing. And so midwives, when Jewish women would give birth to babies, would take a date mixture, a mixture of dates and some other sweeteners, would use it first of all to swab and clean out the mouth to get rid of whatever afterbirth might have been in there. And then they would put a glob of it back toward the base of the tongue and on the lips of the baby to get the baby to taste that sweet stuff and start doing the sucking motion, the nursing motion. And then she would hand the baby to her mother so her mother could breastfeed her. It's that, most probably, at least metaphorically, that the author of Proverbs 22 and verse 6 had in mind. Because metaphorically, it means to build a thirst for, or to develop a thirst for. Whatever we want our children to be, whatever it looks like our children may have an interest in being, we need to feed that. We need to develop a thirst within them to feed on that which is good for them, to feed on that which will lead them. So he says, train up a child. The word child there, by the way, meant everything from a newborn to a man who was just about to get married in Hebrew, the same word. And so here, just simply because of the train up, we assume they're talking about young babies or little children and encouraging us to work with them. There was one religion that used to say, if you give us a child for 5 years, they'll be ours forever. I don't know how true that was, but I know that they made that boast. And we often say, if we have a children's class or something, these kids will remember this much longer because they're learning at a young age. Bring up a child. Spend some time with that baby, with that little boy or girl, to help them develop a thirst for good. Then he adds, in the way he should go. Now that's the English translation of it. A more literal translation in the Hebrew would be, according to his way. Have you ever looked at a family and watched 2 or 3 children grow up in the same home, with the same parents, the same teaching, the same goals, the same everything, and 2 of them just handle it wonderfully and one of them just doesn't work at all? My brother would know who I'm talking about, I think. Most of you wouldn't. I'm not going to mention names, but there were 2 brothers out at 100, and they were kind of that scenario, both raised in the same home, both raised by the same people, both raised with the same methods and values, etc. And one of them worked there in town and was well loved and well liked by everybody, and his brother was constantly in and out of jail and in trouble and just seemed to struggle to function. Well, how do you explain that? There's really only one way to explain it, and that is that each child has their own way. And parents have to do their best to kind of learn what works with this child and what works with this child. Our daughter Leanne, our oldest girl, was the kind of kid that if you just looked at her a little bit mean, she just, almost willed. She was fairly easy to raise because you just had to look at her and let her know you were displeased, and that was the end of it for her. She'd not do that again. Judy was argumentative. Now, if you could end up showing her and it making sense to her she ought to behave a certain way or do something a certain way, she'd be okay with it. She wouldn't like it, but she'd be okay with it. So different from Leanne. And our son, Richard, I don't think I ever really did figure out what his way was. But the point is, they each had their own way. And if you had the same goal for each of them, you were going to get them there different ways. What it took to get Leanne to a point in life was not the same thing that it took to get Judy there or to get Richard there. Each of them had their own distinct personality. And in the midst of all of that, parents have to try to figure out what works and what doesn't. Because the same thing doesn't work with every child. And probably one of the reasons that some homes are homes where 2 or more children grow up with the same people in the same house and the same rules and stuff, and there's such a vast difference between them, is that the parents tried to raise every one of them exactly alike. And we can't do that. You have to determine, is my child more tender-hearted? Is this child more tender-hearted than the other? Is this child a little more rebellious than the other? And work with it. And that's what Proverbs 22 and verse 6 is about. It's about getting parents to know their children so they can use that knowledge to get their children into the way they should go, into their way. Prepare them for life. It's not that you change your goal. You just may have to change how you implement that which will get them to that goal. And Proverbs 22 and verse 6 was never designed to make parents feel bad if a child went wrong. It was simply designed to remind parents that they have a responsibility to know their children and to work with them within the frameworks of their individual personalities. Now, the second passage that I want to point out to you is in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5 is written after the author of Hebrews has just gotten done talking about running the race that's set before us and looking to Jesus who endured the cross and the shame that was approached or attached to it and the hurt and anguish that went along with it so that he could save us. And then he says to a bunch of Hebrew Christians who've been whining about how bad they have it and how much better they'd be if they just abandoned Christianity and went back to Judaism. And he says, listen to me, folks. You haven't endured anything yet like Jesus did. And he compared what they were enduring to the discipline that parents apply to children. Now, I don't know what all the lessons are to be gotten from there, but I want to mention a couple or three of them. First of all, he points out that God is our Father and that the way he deals with us is the way fathers deal with children. And fathers are sometimes the disciplinarians. They are the ones who apply the discipline. Not always, but in many cases they were. When we were growing up, that was almost a given. I can still remember that some of my least favorite words were, you just wait till your father gets home. Didn't you hate to hear those words when you were younger? No one ever said to me, just wait till your mother gets home. But my mom said a lot of times, you just wait till your father gets home. So he compares this dealing of God with his servants to a father dealing with children. And he says, I want you to chasten them. Fathers, chasten them. The word chasten is not punishment. The word chasten means discipline. Punishment can be a part of discipline, but they're not one and the same thing. Discipline just simply means teaching. Only in this regard, it's teaching that involves behavior and consequences. And he says to them, you're going to be chastened. What you're going through is kind of like a father spanking a child or a father putting a child in timeout. He's broken a law or he's struggling with a rule, and this is designed to bring him around to where he needs to be. He adds that earthly fathers do that after their own pleasure. Now, I used to read that and think, yeah, Dad did act like he enjoyed that a little bit too much, you know. I don't know if my dad ever said to us, Dick, I don't know if you can ever remember him saying to you, I don't ever remember him saying this was going to hurt him more than it was going to hurt me. And he'd have been lying if he had said that. But he would discipline us as best he knew. And that's how fathers discipline. They discipline to the best of their ability in ways they think will work. They don't always get it right. Sometimes they're not severe enough. Sometimes they're too severe. Sometimes they're very consistent. Other times they can be very inconsistent. Fathers don't always get discipline right, but they try. And the author of Hebrews says, and you respect them for it. Now, it may take a while for that respect to come, because it's hard to be real respectful when your behind hurts, or when you're being kept from something you enjoy doing. That's when mom and dad are not fair, and life isn't fair, and I'm going to go eat worms. You know, that's when nothing's right. But that changes over time. So he says, remember, there's no chastening or no discipline that seems joyous when you go through it. When you're a parent and you have to discipline a child, they may well end up thanking you for it. But you'll have to wait a while for that thank you. You'll have to have some time to grow and comprehend and understand it better. You may even have to have some children of your own before you really understand that Dad may not have always got it right. But you know, I don't ever remember getting a whole lot of discipline I didn't deserve. And I'm glad that some parents still understand that there's value in discipline, that it is a show of love from parents to children. It's priceless in the effect it can have on children as they grow and as they develop. The author of Hebrews just wanted these Christians to quit whining, to realize that they're going through some parental discipline of sorts. And it's going to make them better people. It's just not very pleasant right now. And his grand example was Jesus. The cross was not a pleasant experience. Do you think that if there would have been any other way, that God would have turned a deaf ear to Jesus in Gethsemane? Do you think if it could have been done any other way, that Jesus would have asked God to take from him the one thing he came to earth knowing he was going to have to bear? It wasn't pleasant. But when it was all over and said and done, the world had reason to be joyful. And we as Christians have reason to be thankful. The third passage is in Romans chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. I think I mentioned the first part of the week that Romans chapter 8 is my favorite chapter of the entire New Testament, maybe of the entire Bible. I love Romans chapter 8. It starts out by reminding us that if we are in Christ, there's no condemnation. It goes on to remind us that with the testimony of the Holy Spirit through the Word and the testimony of our spirits through our obedience, we become and know we are children of God. He goes on then to say that as children of God, we are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. And even though we may have to endure some suffering along the way, it doesn't even compare to what we've got to look forward to. Then he reminds us that when we talk to God about things, we can do so remembering that if we love God, whatever happens in our lives will bring some good. Now, he doesn't promise it'll all be good, but he promises it'll bring about some good. And then in the last few verses, he reminds us that God's for us, that God gave his Son for us. Reminds us that God will justify us. Reminds us that God will make us winners. Reminds us that all of the demons in a devil's hell can't pull us kicking and screaming away from God. And while we can turn and walk away from God anytime we want to, no one can take us away from God. Now, that's a chapter worth reading over and over again. But there are 4 words that come to mind every time I read the section about if children, then heirs, and heirs of God. One is just that of heirs. Children inherit what parents give them. We understand that financially at the end of life, but it's true all the way through life. Children are the heirs of our parenting. And every day we leave them something by the way we love them, by the way we treat them, even by the way we discipline them. I see in that chapter a heavy emphasis upon respect. This great respect that children ought to have for their parents. Now, you want to get on my antsy side in a hurry. If you're younger, be disrespectful to an older person. The smile will vanish in a hurry. I don't like that. And I especially don't like listening to children bossing their parents around. Now, I don't like it because it should never be that way, but I also have to add this, Sharon, sometimes I don't like it because you've allowed it to be that way, and you have set a dangerous precedent for your children as they age and become more accountable for their own behavior. Romans 8 is about guidance. How that God will stand for us and defend us and guide us and help us to get to where all of the troubles of this world are behind us. Parents do that. They lend guidance to their children through their experiences, through their learning. They share with the children things that will help them as they go through life. And I think the 4th thing is integrity. You know, integrity is not really what you believe is right and wrong. That's morality or ethics. Integrity is what you do with what you believe is right or wrong. You may have a wrong set of rules to live by, but you're still a person of integrity if you live by them. If you live consistently doing what you think is right, or if you live consistently staying away from what you think is wrong, you're a person of integrity. And while I think it's important to teach our children from the youngest of ages the difference between right or wrong, sometimes it can start with just sharing. Sometimes it can carry over into inviting children to come who might not get invited by any other children. It can take a lot of forms. We need to teach our children the difference between right and wrong. But even more than that, we need to encourage our children to have the courage, the integrity, to live by what they believe is right or wrong. And Romans chapter 8 talks of God and his relationship with his children in such a way as makes me realize that God wants me to be a person of integrity. He wants me to live by the right code. But he does want me to live by a code. I want to close with a few do's and a few don'ts. Number 1, and these are the do's, set boundaries. Children need to know, and believe it or not, most of them, at least for a time in their lives, want to know how far they can push it. They want to know where or when they've gone too far. Make sure your children know the boundaries. And punishment probably should come only if they step over the line. Until they know there's a line, they ought not to be punished if they cross it. But once they know they're a line, it's no longer just doing something they shouldn't have done. Then it's being disobedient. Then it's being rebellious. So set boundaries and start early doing it. Be consistent. Don't get mad over this and then laugh about it at another time. Don't let your children behave in a grocery store one way and get after them, and then let them act that way at home and it's fine. Be consistent. Be realistic. Just be honest. What can your child do and what can't your children do? Our son was never as good a student as our two daughters. It wouldn't have been realistic for us to have expected him to bring home the same quality of report cards that his sisters did. But you know what? What we knew he could do, we expected him to do. And today he works as a nurse's aide and was just named the Employee of the Year for the care center and company that he works for. Because hopefully we were realistic with him. And we kept him heading in directions that we felt were appropriate and within his ability. Want your child to be in heaven. I don't know how many times I've heard Marty say to the kids, if I don't have any other thing to look forward to, I want to look forward to seeing you in heaven with me. Parents, that should always be the number one goal, is to want those children to go to heaven. And I might add, in capital letters, if you're taking notes, time. Give your children time. Give them some of your time. Because, buddy, it'll pass so fast your head will spin. All three of my children are in their 40s now. One is very near her 50s. It just seems like yesterday I held him for the first time. But I don't have to tell you that. You already know that. It won't be long till he'll be bringing you to church. It goes fast. Give them time. They will value that time more than anything you can buy at Toys R Us by working hours and hours and hours of overtime. Now just a handful of don'ts very quickly. Don't assume that what works with one works with all. Well, we've already talked about that. Don't ever compare siblings in their presence. Why can't you get better grades? Your sister gets better grades. Why don't you just take him and hit him with a sledgehammer? It'd probably do about as much good. It wouldn't hurt anymore. Why can't you behave like your brother does? It may be true. And you probably need to deal with it. But you don't need to deal with it right in front of them and make one of them feel like a heel. Don't compare with siblings. Don't try to relive your life through them. You were a great athlete. Maybe your child would rather be an artist. If that's the way they should go, you help them be the best artists they can be, whether they ever put on a set of pads or not. You like to work with people. Maybe your child would rather be a CPA and only have to deal with people when he licks an envelope. Let him. Don't try to relive your life through them. Never show partiality. Joseph was a wonderful example. One of the few men that you're just hard to find anything wrong about him in Scripture. But boy, his dad made a big mistake. He let Joseph be his favorite boy. And it created all kinds of tension in the family and ultimately a lot of misery for Joseph. Don't overprotect. After your children go out on their own, Their bosses aren't going to be like mom and dad. When a little girl goes to kindergarten, she's not princess anymore. Don't overprotect them. Obviously, it's our job to protect them. But you know what I mean. Don't give them an unrealistic view of life. Help them to understand, at times by experience, that not everything's going to work out right. They have to learn through disappointments just as surely as they have to learn or get to learn through enjoyment and through good things. Don't be an enabler. If your children waste their lives, don't finance it. If your children throw away your values, don't encourage them in it. I think the hardest thing in the world mom and dad ever have to do is say no, even to a child who has broken their heart over and over and over again, because they would be better off to say no than to enable them to go on living the same old life that they've chosen to live. Don't ask me how good I am at that. I will only tell you I'm better at preaching that than I am at doing that. Maybe we all are. But try not to enable. And I'll just close with this thought. Jesus said 7 things from the cross that we know of. One of them was, behold your mother. He made sure Mary was taken care of. Another was, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I'm told by scholars that that passage from the Old Testament had become, in fact, the opening words of a Jewish child's bedtime prayer, comparable in our ages to, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. That the last thing Jesus said from the cross was a prayer of childlike faith in a parent, because he knew that parent cared. And your children will love and respect you when they know you care. You don't have them those first few years to be their friend. You have them to be their mom or dad. But if you do your best at being their mom or dad, there'll come a time in life when you'll automatically be their friend, and you'll be thankful to God. If you're here tonight and not a Christian, God can become your father and you his child. Clinton can receive you, accept your confession of faith in Christ as God's Son, and bury you with him in baptism for the remission of sins. We certainly hope you'll do that. And if you're a parent and you've not yet done that, we would encourage you to do it and get God on your side early. Maybe you've obeyed the gospel, but you've drifted or you're struggling. We'll pray about that. All you have to do is let us know. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you need to respond, make your way to the front of the building while we stand and while we sing.